Daniel Keller told this story once, on a late-night radio program, to a host he'd never met. He called because he was forgetting it, he said. Every day there was less of it. He'd written it all down. The way you'd take minutes, so it couldn't get away from him. It was getting away from him anyway. That morning the paper had come back blank, so he figured if he said it out loud into somebody's machine, some of it might stick. What follows is his account, as he gave it that night. The months since have done nothing to contradict it. It started with his father. Arthur Keller ran the janitor's closet at the school for 30 years and did carpentry on the side. The most honest man Dan ever knew, which is exactly why what happened. Emerson Vale owned half the valley, rental houses, a sawmill. The land on both sides of the creek. He and Arthur had words, years back. Over a boundary line, Arthur said Vale's surveyor had moved the stakes onto their side. Vale smiled. Rich, so the town let it go. Arthur got sick that fall. Not old man sick. Something wrong. He lost weight. Then he couldn't keep food down. Then he couldn't stand. Dan was driving him to Albany for tests when Arthur grabbed his arm and pulled him close, and his eyes had something in them Dan had never seen. Scared, not of dying, of something else. Emerson brought the men downstairs. He said, "They're beating me, Dan. Go down and appeal for me." He didn't say what he meant. That night his whole body swelled up red, like he'd been boiled, and he screamed until he died. Dan held his hand. He heard it stop. The funeral was a Tuesday. The widow Vale had a claim on the land by Thursday. Her lawyer said the boundary was hers and she wanted them out of the farmhouse by spring. Friday was the hearing. They were going to lose. Their lawyer said it plain. No money, no case. The night before the hearing, Dan was standing in the kitchen, and he stopped. That is the only way to say it. He stopped. Meg called his name, and he couldn't answer. They put him in the hospital. 9 days, machines breathing for him. The doctor called it grief, psychogenic, a kind of shock, words like that. But the EEG kept showing a brain that looked awake. Because he was awake, he was somewhere else. At first, he thought he was in the hospital basement. The light was wrong, flat and white, and the halls had numbers on them. Departments 2 through 40-something. Queues. People in gray uniforms with clipboards, calling names off a screen. It looked like the DMV. It was the most ordinary-looking thing in the world. Offices, endless offices. He knew where to go. He couldn't say how. The way you know a phone number. He walked down to the intake cages, and his father was in one of them. His legs were broken at angles that weren't angles anymore. They'd been beating him. There was a clerk at the end of the row, and Dan watched him take an envelope out of a tray, open it, and write in a ledger. Another clerk leaned over. "Vale account cleared," he said. "Good for another week." That is when Dan started to understand what his father meant. Emerson Vale had died 2 years before them, and he found out what money buys, even down there. He wrote out a complaint. There are always forms, so he filled his out in line like everybody else. County Intake Court, Department 7. The judge was a gray man in a gray suit. He read the form, set it down, and said, "No evidence." Dan told him his father was in the cage with his legs broken. The judge said, "No evidence." Then he nodded. 2 men in gray held Dan down and beat him. 20 they counted. Dan shouted at him, "Because he could help it. I earned that." What was I thinking, coming in here without money? The judge wasn't angry about the shouting. He was bored. That was the worst part of all of it. Not evil, bored. The appeal went to the district office. Dan waited half a month in the transit lounge with the others waiting on paperwork. Then they called his name. The district man listened just long enough to read the file, then beat Dan and sent the case back. Remanded. That is the word he used. Remanded to the county for reconsideration. So Dan went back to Department 7, and they beat him again. And this time the judge didn't even look at him. He just said, "Escort him out." Two men walked him to a door with a green exit sign. Past it, the white room where his body lay with the machines around it. He could hear Meg's voice, Friday, their lawyer. She didn't know what he would have wanted. He couldn't walk through that door, not with his father still in the cage. He turned around and ran. He ran until he found the central registry, a building so big you stopped being able to see the walls. He filed a complaint against both offices, cruelty, corruption, all of it. That is when things turn strange in the quiet way they do down there. Two men came to see him at the transit lounge. They didn't threaten him. "Drop the complaint," they said, "and everything up top gets fixed. The lawsuit disappears, the mortgage paid, the medical bills. His father was already taken care of. He didn't need to keep this up." The man who ran the transit lounge pulled Dan aside that night. He was the first one down there who talked to him like he was a person. "You're too stubborn," he said. "They're offering you a way out and you won't take it. Both offices have written to the registrar, letters in his hand. You're finished." Dan said that was just talk. Transients talk. The man looked at him, his voice going quiet. "Nobody walks out of the registrar's court," he said. "And the ones who do come out smaller." Dan didn't believe him, because the whole building ran on rules, forms, stamps, procedures printed on the wall. And he'd spent his life believing that if you follow the rules, somebody above you has to follow them too. That is what a higher court is for. The gray men came for him at dawn. The registrar didn't let Dan get out a word. He raised his hand, and Dan took 20 lashes. Then he raised it again, and they took him to the procedure room. There was a table in the middle of it. Steel. Under it, a bed of fire, and the surface itself was glowing red. They stripped Dan, put him on it, and held him there while he cooked. He wanted to say it hurt, but hurt is a word for something that ends. This didn't end. His skin went black. His bones showed through in places, and he didn't die. He couldn't die. When they pulled him off, he could stand barely, and they walked him back. The registrar looked at him over his glasses. "Do you still appeal?" And Dan said, "My grievance isn't answered. My heart isn't dead. If I told you I was done, I'd be lying to you. I'm not done." The registrar asked what he'd complain about. Dan said, "Everything I just went through. That is what I'd complain about." He didn't get angry. That is the part Dan thinks about. He just looked tired. "Take him to the saw." They clamped Dan between two boards and hoisted him up. There was a blade over his head, round like a mill saw. Dan heard the men behind him. One of them said, "Brave one," and another one said, "And Dan would swear to this on anything you name. He is innocent, and he is a good son. Run the blade wide. Don't touch the heart." The blade came down through the top of his head. Dan felt his skull split and his chest, and he did not make a sound. That is the truth. He bit through his lip, but he didn't make a sound. The blade curved when it reached his chest. He felt it curve, and then it went down through his middle and out. The boards opened, and his two halves fell apart onto the floor, and he was still thinking. That is the part nobody believes. He was lying in two pieces on the floor, and he could hear his own heart going. From both sides they pushed him back together. It hurt worse than the saw, and one of the jailers came over, unclipped the gray belt from his own waist, and tied it around him tight. The pain stopped. "Just like that," he said. "Wear this, for the ones who don't stop." Dan could walk. He walked back into the court and knelt. The registrar asked the same question, and Dan told him no. He was done, because he was afraid of the saw again, and he didn't think he could take it twice. But he said it. The registrar released him. Two escorts walked Dan out the north gate and pointed home, then left. He stood there thinking about his father in the cage and the board judge and the letters to the registrar, and he turned and walked south, toward the only thing the transients ever whispered about, the auditor's office. The one man in the whole registry who'd never taken anything. Nobody could even agree on what he looked like. The escorts caught up before he got far. The registrar thought you'd do this, one of them said, and they marched him back. Dan was sure he was finished, but the registrar didn't look angry, patient, like a man closing a file. Your father's grievance is settled, he said. I've cleared it myself. He has been placed with a good family. There is nothing left for you to shout about. I'm sending you home. The house is yours, the lawsuit finished. A long life. Is that enough? He wrote it in a ledger right in front of Dan, stamped it with a seal that covered half the page, and made him look. Dan thanked him. He bowed. Even. Then the escorts took him out, and one of them spat on the road and said, "Slippery little rat. One more trip and we feed you to the mill. They grind you fine in the mill." Dan shouted back. He didn't know where it came from. "I took the saw. I took the table. You think I'm scared of a few licks from you." And he turned and ran back toward the registrar's building. The escorts went pale. They ran after him, coaxing, sweet-talking. Dan didn't run fast. He made them keep his pace, and he stopped to rest every few steps, and they didn't dare touch him. They came to a village at evening, and there was a door, half open. One of the escorts said, "Sit here, rest." Dan sat on the threshold, and they pushed him through. He came back to himself as a newborn, in a bright room with rows of cribs and women in gray moving between them. They brought him a bottle, and he knew, the way you know a room is wrong, that if he took it, he would stop being himself. He wouldn't take it. He screamed for 3 days while they tried to feed him, and on the 3rd day the little body gave out and went still, and he was out of it. Back in the corridors, worn down, somehow thinner, but he still remembered everything. He turned south and ran. He ran south a long time. Then he saw a motorcade coming. Gray sedans, no lights, moving slow, like a funeral that wasn't in a hurry. He got off the road, but the man in the lead car saw him anyway, and next thing he knew, he was on his knees beside the middle car, and the door was open. The man inside was young, younger than Dan, plain clothes, no tie, stubble, tired eyes. Dan remembers thinking, this isn't him. The portrait in the lobby of the Central Registry shows an old man with a beard and robes. Just a guy who'd been up too long. He asked who Dan was, and Dan poured it out. His father, the cage, the judges, the table, the saw, the belt, the bottle. He had nothing left to lose when he finished. The young man nodded, and he said to an official standing by the car, "This is the one from below. He wants to appeal. Decide his case." And the official said, "Yes, auditor." The hearing was in a plain room. His father was there, not placed with a good family, standing in the corner in the same broken clothes from the cage, holding himself up against the wall. He looked at Dan and nodded once, like he'd always known Dan would make it. Emerson Vale was there. The jailers were there. Then they brought in the registrar and the 2 judges, in chains in a cart. Dan told the whole story a second time with all of them standing there. And every time he named a name, somebody went a little grayer. When he finished, the auditor didn't ask them if it was true. He looked at the ledger and said, "The file was never closed. The stamp is yours." Then he read the sentence. Dan remembers most of it, not all. It is going but most to the registrar. The table you heated for him is heated for you. To the county judge and the district man, flay them, send them back through the door. With the cattle this time. To the jailers, the mill. The one you promised him. To Emerson Vale, struck from the register. His estate passes to the family of the plaintiff. And to his father, 36 years, restored to his term. They carried the sentence out in the yard. There is no need to describe what it looked like. Dan and his father copied the sentence down, the way you'd copy a receipt, and read it together walking home. Father and son, reading. That part Dan would give anything to keep. The words were clear as anything. Then they crossed the boundary, and they went soft, like ink in water. By the time Dan was back in his body, he could barely hold on to 3 of them. Table cattle, 36. He woke up in the hospital. He was out of bed before they could stop him, and he made them open the grave. He told the coroner his father's death wasn't natural. The swelling, the screaming over and over, until the coroner signed the paper. They opened the coffin. Arthur was still frozen. Not cold frozen. Dan sat with him all day, the way the registrar's court had made him sit. Toward evening his chest moved. Once, then again. Then he opened his eyes. He lived. He is alive now. Most days in the next room he doesn't talk about it. He has never said one word about what happened down there, and Dan doesn't ask. But the day he could talk again, he took Dan's hand and said, "I heard you, all of it." The lawsuit went the other way. The widow's claim fell apart. Her own surveyor changed his story, and the farm came back to them, then the rest with it. Vale's land. Vale's houses piece by piece, until they owned more than Vale ever had. A man in town bought one of the parcels off the widow's estate. He dreamed a man in gray stood at his bed and said, "That is the Keller's land." He laughed. His corn came up dead 3 years running, and he sold it back for what he paid. Dan wrote the whole sentence down, every word, so it couldn't get away from him. That morning the paper was blank. On the program that night, the host asked if he had any proof. Dan told him about the scar, right down the middle of him. From the top of his head down to, it stops before his stomach, and it curves. A surgical scar doesn't curve like that. The doctors had looked at it and gone quiet. They said it looked like an old sternotomy, and Dan had never had surgery, never a stitch in his life before this. And the paper, Dan said. "I wrote the sentence on it. I'll show you. Hold on. It is in the drawer." The host heard him cross the room on the open line, heard a drawer open. When Dan came back, his voice had changed. "It is not in the drawer. It was right here this morning. I put it in this drawer. I wrote every word with a pencil, and it was here. And now it is." The host called his name twice. There was a long silence. Then the line went dead.